Okay. Thanks to the organizers for inviting two representatives from DOE. As Eric said, he spent time, probably more time than I, in the Office of Basic Energy Sciences, so he could probably do actually a better job than me of giving this talk. But I will jump in. Whereas ARPA-E is probably the youngest part of DOE, Basic Energy Sciences, or BES, is one of the oldest. DOE is now almost 40 years old as an agency, and BES, in one form or another, has been part of it since almost the beginning in the late 70s or early 80s. So briefly, I'll tell everyone an overview of the BES mission. I suspect that many of you, we'll do the show of hands, who knows anything about basic energy sciences? Quite a few, not surprisingly. So we'll go through that quickly and remind you of the mission of BES. I'll talk about really the two main things that BES does, which is research funding and construction and operation of scientific user facilities. I'll spend some time talking about what's new, particularly what's upcoming, at least in the 2016 President's Request. And if I have some time at the end, I have a few research highlights, and particularly told as success stories of how basic science can have an impact technologically. So this is unreadable. This is the organization chart for the Department of Energy. Eric's box is sitting off there to the right under ARPA-E, but what I've highlighted in the middle is the Office of the Undersecretary for Science and Energy. And the small box under that is the Office of Science. The Office of Science is the fundamental science funding office within Department of Energy. All the stuff off on the left is the National Nuclear Security Administration, the nuclear weapons part of DOE, which I won't talk about at all. And the stuff off to the right is the management and operations part. But really the science, and then the boxes that I haven't highlighted under that, all of the technology offices that also operate under this single undersecretary. So the Office of Science is a roughly $5 billion per year budget, of which about a third is the Office of Basic Energy Sciences, where I sit, and which I'm going to be talking about today. So Basic Energy Science Program mission is to support fundamental research, to understand, predict, and ultimately, if we're successful, control matter and energy at all scales, electronic scale, atomic scale, molecular levels, as a foundation. It is really the work that we support in BES is the foundation on which we believe, we hope, that future energy technologies, really breakthrough technologies, will be built. Without that foundation, the likelihood or the timescale for success technologically, it's less likely or will take much longer. The office is split into three divisions, two research divisions, the Material Science and Engineering Division and the Chemical Sciences, Geosciences, and Biosciences Division. Eric actually, before going to ARPA-E, was the director of that Chemical Sciences, etc. division for a number of years. He knows BES well, and so when I get into trouble on those questions, because I'm a condensed matter physicist by training, I'm going to defer to Eric. And then finally, the third critically important division is the so-called Scientific User Facility Division, which builds and operates a number of major open user facilities, which I'll talk about later in this talk. So if we look at BES research activities, which span those two divisions I mentioned, Material Sciences and the Chem Sciences, Geosciences, Biosciences Division, there's sort of three main funding modalities that we can bin all of the research projects into. The core research programs are typically single investigator and some small group research done primarily at universities and DOE national labs, though there is some industrial research in that. More than 1,300 projects currently. Those are grouped topically, so within each of those divisions, they're on the order of 15 programs, core research areas managed by PhD program managers who manage those projects. Going down here in the slide, but up in size and scale, are the Energy Frontier Research Centers. That's actually currently what I am managing. So I manage what are now 32 multidisciplinary, multi-investigator research centers, each of which is funded at $2 to $4 million per year for 4 years, focusing on fundamental research aimed at particular technological areas to really drive innovation. And finally, at the bottom of the chart, the largest funding modality is the Energy Innovation Hubs. 2 of which are in BES. There are a total of 4 hubs. I'll talk about them later. This is a program that spans all of DOE, not just the Office of Science, but 2 of those hubs are managed by the Office of Basic Energy Sciences. Those are funded at $15 to $25 million per year, so again, another jump up in size. And they span from basic research to applied research and even technology prototyping and technology development. And I'll talk a little bit more about those coming up. So leaving the core research out because of time constraints here, there's lots of information about each of those core research areas on our website. And actually, Eric reminded me, I should mention most of those core research programs are funded through an open solicitation that is issued every year. It's open all year. There's not a submission window, so you can submit a proposal for a core research area to BES any day of the year, every year. As Eric mentioned, you should read the content of that funding opportunity announcement in the particular topical area of interest, because that will define for you what those core research areas are focused on. The Energy Frontier Research Centers program is relatively new. It was established coming on 6 years ago now, and it was an outgrowth really of a 5 or 6 years of strategic planning by the Office of Basic Energy Sciences. Highlighted here, what these are the covers of a series of workshops and subsequent reports in topical areas referred to as the Basic Research Needs Series. So these were a series of workshops that were organized by BES, but drawing really the communities together in different topical areas: solar energy, energy storage, hydrogen, catalysis, geosciences, et cetera. There were 10 of these workshops that were topically focused and meant to really define priority research areas, priority science areas in each of these technological spaces. And those became essentially the strategic planning for the establishment of these Energy Frontier Research Centers, or EFRCs, which were solicited first in 2009, and the solicitation called for building teams, multidisciplinary teams of researchers to attack these really challenging science problems that, if successful, will have impact technologically. Again, they're science-focused centers, but the science is use-inspired, inspired by the popular technology space. So this is a summary. There were 46 of those centers initially funded in 2009, a total of $777 million over the first 5 years of the program. $277 million of that, however, was from the Recovery Act, and as a result, when we recompeted the program last year with the $100 million per year base funding, we were only able to fund 32 centers. So the current program is 32 centers funded, as I said, for $2 to $4 million a year for up to 4 years. There are almost all of them involve collaborations between universities and national labs. 23 of them are led by universities, 8 are led by labs. But as I said, nearly all of them have participants at both labs and universities. The map shows you distribution geographically of these centers across the country. 32 states, actually I think 33 states now. We had a PI move from a state to a state that we didn't have any PIs in before, so we picked up a state a couple months ago. I'll mention here at the bottom in FY16, and I'll come back to this later, there is a request we've been trying to grow the program because effectively, as you see, with the loss of these Recovery Act funds, the program took about a 30% hit, shrunk by 30%. We would like to grow it back up, at least toward that average $150 million per year. That will happen over time if we're lucky. So there's a request in the 2016 President's budget to increase to $110 million, so that's a $10 million increase. If that happens, there will likely be a call for new proposals. It will likely be a targeted call in topical areas that complement the existing portfolio. And obviously, I can't say a lot more about what those might be until that comes. There is a plan, however, starting in 2016, assuming that the appropriations will support it, to have biennial calls for EFRC proposals every other year. As I said, the first one was in 2009, and then there wasn't another call until 2014, 5 years later. That's a long time. Things change, and we would like to have the opportunity for new participants in the program more frequently than that. The Energy Innovation Hubs that I mentioned earlier was a concept initiated by the previous Secretary of Energy, Secretary Chu, in some sense based on his experience having been at Bell Labs in an environment where everything from the most fundamental science to technology development and deployment was happening, quote unquote, under one roof. He felt that there was a need for that kind of funding mechanism within the Department of Energy. So the concept of having these single, strongly led, strongly managed, $25 million per year centers started. He actually had proposed initially 8 of these centers in different topical areas. We do not yet have 8 such hubs. We have currently 4 such hubs. The 2 of which in the middle with the BES red stars are the ones I mentioned, managed by the Office of Basic Energy Sciences. One is the Joint Center for Artificial Photosynthesis. How do you generate fuels, chemical fuels from sunlight, like plants do, but doing it artificially, which was started in 2010 and is actually under review right now for renewal. The second one, managed by BES, is the Batteries and Energy Storage, or the Joint Center for Energy Storage Research, focused on energy storage, not surprisingly. There are 2 others managed outside of BES, the CASTLE, the Consortium for Advanced Simulation of Light Water Reactors, managed by the Office of Nuclear Energy, surprisingly, and the Critical Materials Institute, which is actually managed by the Advanced Manufacturing Office within the ERC, Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. So these are the 4 hubs. There was an buildings efficiency hub shown at the bottom here, which has been scaled down and is no longer referred to as a hub, but there's still the Consortium for Building Efficiency and Innovation, which grew out of this project. Okay, let me say a few words now about that third piece of BES that I mentioned earlier, the scientific user facilities. This is really a huge chunk of what BES does, and in fact a huge resource for the community. So Basic Energy Sciences has constructed and operates a number of large user facilities. They're listed down here on the bottom. There are now 5 light sources, 2 neutron scattering sources, and 5 nanoscience research centers. Again, as is shown up on the right here, these are available. These are open at no cost if the research is non-proprietary to anybody. So it's not a DOE complex. I mean, it's not limited to the DOE complex. They are all cited at DOE National Labs, but they are open to anybody in the research community. The access is based on a proposal process. You submit a proposal, and if the proposals are reviewed by the facilities using external reviewers, and the ones that are successful are given access time, beam time on the light sources, neutron sources, access to the nanoscience centers. I'll also point out that we did, until recently, have 3 e-beam microcharacterization centers. Those have actually been folded operationally into 3 of the nanoscience centers. So those of you who are familiar with the scientific user facilities and wondering where the e-beam centers disappeared to, well, they've been folded into the nanocenters at Oak Ridge, Argonne, and Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, and are operating as part of those nanocenters, but they're still operating as they were before. There's also a mechanism, and all of these facilities have some amount of this, for proprietary research to be done at the facilities. There's a cost recovery mechanism involved in the proprietary research. But the vast majority of research done at these facilities is non-proprietary and done at no cost to the user other than getting to the facility. This is a timeline of users. It's currently over 16,000 users at these facilities collectively in 2014. You see how it's grown over time. I'm not going to go through all what these little bars are, but the big bars on the base here are mainly the light sources. The majority of the users are at the 5 light sources that I mentioned earlier. And if you look at just those light sources and where those users are coming from based on their employer, half of them, or more than half, are university-based. So it's really a huge resource, and this is true also at the neutron facilities and the nanocenters, but we have the most statistics for the light sources, going back here to 1990. So this blue bar on the bottom is university researchers. A lot of students, a lot of postdocs, and of course, faculty members coming to these facilities. And again, in 2014, this is 11,000 users a year at these light sources alone. But there's also, as you see, industry use, obviously DOE National Lab use, international users, not a huge number, but we do have international users coming to use these facilities. Okay, so what's new? In the few minutes I have left, I've alluded to a few things in the 2016 President's Budget Request. So this is the summary of the budget requests. So up in the right-hand corner, the request for the BES portion of the DOE budget is $1.85 billion, up slightly from the 2015 appropriation, which was about 1.7, a little over 1.7 billion. As you see, a good chunk of that, almost half of it, goes to simply operating those facilities I mentioned. They're obviously costly to operate these huge facilities. The construction of new facilities, and I'll talk about what construction is going on now, is another big chunk, the light blue on the top. And then over on the left-hand side, you see the research programs, the material science and engineering in yellow, chemical science and geosciences, biosciences, both of which are between $250 and $300 million per year. The Energy Frontier Research Centers and Hubs in green, and an SBIR program, as every agency has highlighted there. Some things to point out about along the lines of what is new. I mentioned the Energy Frontier Research Centers. There's a request for an additional $10 million to grow that program next year by 10%. We're obviously waiting for appropriation, Congress to do their appropriating. We'll see what happens. There's also a request for $5 million to fund mid-scale instrumentation for ultra-fast electron scattering, and I'll say more about that in a minute. There's a request to grow a new program in computational material sciences, which was started this year at $8 million. There's a request to grow that by 50% to $12 million, so an additional $4 million. And I'll have another slide about that coming up. We are trying, and we continue to try, to keep the facilities operating at quote-unquote optimal. This budget, by our estimates, gets them to 99% of optimal, which is pretty good. They have, over the last few years, with sequestration and other constraints, been operating what we would think of as below optimal, meaning fewer hours per year and not the full staffing. And finally, there are construction projects going on, which I'll mention, up a new facility, one big new facility that's just coming online, and upgrades to 2 existing facilities. So this says a lot of what I just already said about what's new, so I will jump through this. Let me say a word about computational material sciences, because in fact, as I mentioned, this is a new program that was just initiated this year in 2015 with $8 million appropriated. The call has already gone out, and in fact, the first gate, which was the letters of intent, was last month. So unfortunately, the program, if you haven't yet seen it, is too late for this year. But the goal here is really to advance computational codes and capabilities in the US for doing material science. The plot on the left is actually showing the application codes running at the computing facility at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, NERSC, and where those codes were written. And while you see a lot of American flags along the right-hand side, though, most of those are not for material science. They're in space outside of material science. And it turns out that the most popular codes for material science have typically not been developed in the US. So there's has been a sense for a number of years that there needs to be more support in the US for doing computational material science work, and that's what this program is supporting. So the funding opportunity went out for teams of researchers to develop codes that would then be disseminated to the community. So the deliverable, stated at the top here, is really these open source community codes and packages incorporating multiple length and time scales for development, prediction of new materials. So this fits in and supports, in fact, the larger Materials Genome Initiative, which is the cross-government initiative to more rapidly develop and predict new materials. There is a component, actually, even though this is the computational material sciences, was a component in the funding opportunity announcement of validation, experimental validation. So these groups will have experimental work as well, testing the predictive capabilities of the models. As I mentioned, the hope, it's funded at $8 million this year. Those awards will be announced probably this summer, and the hope is to add an additional $4 million to the program in 2016. I mentioned mid-scale instrumentation. We had another workshop similar to those basic research needs workshops I mentioned. The cover of that is shown in the bottom right, on the future of electron scattering and diffraction. And based on that workshop and the recommendations or the findings of that workshop and that report, there is a request for $5 million in the FY16 budget to support development of instrumentation for ultra-fast electron and diffraction for both material sciences and chemical sciences. So this is a mid-scale instrumentation program, if funded, that we hope to initiate in FY16. So stay tuned for more on that. Okay, and finally a couple comments about facilities. So the newest in the suite of BES facilities is the National Synchrotron Light Source 2. The National Synchrotron Light Source at Brookhaven National Lab was shut down last year, and this new facility, which is now state-of-the-art in brightness, world-class brightness X-ray light source, is coming up and operational. In fact, I think we'll have formal approval of start of operations this summer, but in fact, a month ago, the Secretary of Energy was there with the ribbon cutting. They got their first light back in October, and by all accounts, it is on track. It actually came in under budget and ahead of schedule, or at least on schedule, helped in part by Recovery Act. The Recovery Act, this is one case where there really was a quote-unquote shovel-ready project in the planning stages back in 2009, where the Recovery Act funding was really able to accelerate the construction phase. There are also two, as I mentioned, upgrade projects underway. The LINAC Coherent Light Source, which is a X-ray free electron laser operating at SLAC laboratory out at Stanford, making use of the old linear accelerator that was the high energy physics linear accelerator to produce a now operating X-ray free electron laser. This LCLS2 is an upgrade to that using another section of the LINAC to upgrade that system, and in addition an upgrade to the advanced photon source at Argonne National Lab, providing extreme coherence and extreme brightness for that facility at Argonne. Okay, I think I have a couple minutes. I will step through these quickly. There's a lot of detail here, but I put in just to give you a flavor of well, in some sense, how we measure success. It's fundamental science, so having metrics, as one might have in another area, is not really relevant. We are doing the foundational research. In fact, some aspects of what BES funds is really discovery science, where you're not aimed at a particular technology, you're not aimed at a particular capability, or but really just understanding new materials, new chemical processes, new systems, understanding the science. But there's also the aspect of it that we would call use-inspired basic science, which is to say we understand in the energy space where the roadblocks are. And there's lots of places where science can play a part there. And the success, and it often takes lots of time, ultimately is, can the basic science have an impact and be translated, as Eric mentioned at RPE, this tech to market, or this valley of death between the basic science and applied research, technology development, and deployment. And so I show here a few examples that we've collected over the years of fundamental science supported by BES that has actually had an impact in some technology space. So this is some work done on the left-hand side at the University of Illinois on developing synthetic techniques for producing semiconductor materials for solar photovoltaics, producing these small platelet-like crystals, which are shown in the top left, and then actually a pick-and-place kind of mechanism for assembling these. The thing on the bottom left, which is false colored, is actually an SEM image. That's a real structure. That's not just a cartoon. And then some applied R&D supported not by BES, but by ERE, Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, to develop flexible arrays of these photovoltaic cells. And finally, these cells are being used by a startup company, Semprius, that was actually started by two faculty members at the University of Illinois, John Rogers and Ralph Nuzzo. So here's an example of how basic science done a number of years ago, but can transition to technology. Here's a similar story in the battery space. This is work done primarily at Argonne. Some of it starting back actually in the 1990s in the upper left there. Nanostructured composite cathode materials for lithium-ion batteries. So this is looking at lithium manganese oxide materials that for the cathode in lithium-ion batteries, characterizing those using the advanced photon source, for example, at Argonne. Again, the applied R&D supported by the applied offices at DOE to produce these cathode materials and demonstrate cells, and then licensing of that to companies. In fact, so these materials are now being used in the batteries that are in the Chevy Volt. And at the bottom here, actually, this is sort of a much more recent example. Also at Argonne, actually the work was done at Northwestern through in EFRC led by Argonne, looking at the anode side of the battery and looking at graphene silicon anode materials as a possible improvement on the anode side of the lithium-ion batteries, which has now led to a startup company called Synode. Okay, they're trying to produce these materials. They're much newer, and they're not in any current existing batteries, but it's a nice story. In fact, the graduate student who did the research is now the CTO of the startup company. Here's an example in the biosciences space, some work done at an ERC at Purdue University called C3 Bio, where they developed a new one-step catalysis for catalyzing lignin and found that they could produce high-value chemicals out of this process. Patent, they filed a patent, which was licensed by a startup company again called Spiro Energy. Spiro Energy received DOE SBIR funding, so this is another mechanism again for doing the tech transfer. Probably should have picked an ARPA-E example. We have those as well. This middle column is always, the hardest. How do you take the basic science and get to the manufacturing and commercialization stage? And Spiro now is trying to produce these, use this process to produce liquid aromatics and potentially using the byproducts to produce fuels. And finally, this is an example. This is actually a very long-term one, quantum dot research done at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab more than 10 years ago, demonstrating that the size of quantum dots defines the frequency, the color at which they luminesce. The development of these materials as quantum dot luminescent materials has now been picked up by two very different technologies, displays, quantum dot displays, which you can now buy. They're not the most inexpensive displays, but you can actually buy TVs that are quantum dot TVs. But also using these same quantum dots as fluorescence probes in biomedical assays. So here's an example where one science project, one scientific research spawned two very different technologies into two very different technology spaces. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. There is a huge amount of information on our website, which I've listed at the bottom here, but if you just Google DOE BES, I think this is the first thing you find, which is our website, which makes it pretty easy. We also produce documents. The document on the top is sort of a high-level brochure that we've recently developed, giving you an overview. BES, I actually brought some copies of that. It's just a folded two-page brochure, very thin if you want a high level. There's lots more details in this research summaries document. It's literally thousands of pages, giving you essentially a abstract and the participants for every funded project in BES. That is not, we don't print that document, but it's available in PDF and you can search it on our website. So thank you very much for your time.